Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent their weekends at the mall or painting their nails, she was out in the garage with her father, learning how to fix engines and handle tools. Her mother constantly worried about her tomboy nature, always suggesting she should be more feminine, more ladylike. But Sarah had bigger dreams than becoming another pretty face in their sleepy town. At 18, she made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She enlisted in the Navy. Her parents were devastated, her friends confused, and her boyfriend furious. How could she give up a comfortable life to join the military? But Sarah saw something they couldn't see. She saw an opportunity to prove that being a woman didn't mean being weak. The basic training was brutal, but Sarah pushed through every challenge. While other female recruits struggled with the physical demands, she excelled. Her drill instructors noticed her determination, her refusal to quit when things got tough. She could run faster, lift more, and endure longer than most of the men in her unit. Word spread quickly about the girl from Texas who wouldn't back down from anything. After completing basic training with honors, Sarah set her sights on something most people thought was impossible for a woman. She wanted to become a Navy SEAL. The program had never accepted women before, but recent policy changes had opened the door. Sarah knew it would be the fight of her life, but she was ready for the battle. Her family thought she had lost her mind. Her mother cried for days, begging her to choose a safer path. Her father, though proud of her strength, worried about what she was getting herself into. The Navy SEALs were the elite of the elite, and the training was designed to break even the strongest men. But Sarah had made up her mind. She was going to shatter every stereotype and prove that courage had no gender. The selection process was grueling beyond imagination. Hundreds of candidates started the program, but only a handful would make it through. Sarah found herself surrounded by men who looked at her with everything from curiosity to outright hostility. Some wanted to see her fail. Others were simply skeptical that any woman could handle what was coming. But Sarah kept her head down and focused on one thing, proving them all wrong. The instructors pushed her harder than anyone else, testing her limits at every turn. They wanted to see if she would crack under pressure, if she would use her gender as an excuse when things got tough. But Sarah never complained, never asked for special treatment, never showed weakness. She carried the same heavy equipment as the men, ran the same distances, completed the same impossible tasks. Weeks turned into months of relentless training. Sarah's body was pushed to its absolute limits. She lost weight, gained muscle, and developed calluses on her hands from all the rope climbing and weapon handling. Her once long hair was now cut short and practical. The girl from Texas was transforming into something entirely different, a warrior. The other trainees began to respect her. They saw that she wasn't there for attention or to make a political statement. She was there for the same reason they were, to become the best of the best. Slowly but surely, she earned her place among them. When someone struggled, she helped them up. When missions seemed impossible, she found a way to complete them. She wasn't trying to be one of the boys. She was simply being herself, and that was enough. As graduation approached, Sarah knew she had achieved something remarkable. She had survived training that broke most men who attempted it. She had proven that determination and skill mattered more than size or gender. But she also knew that the real test was still ahead of her. Soon she would be deployed on actual missions, where the stakes would be life and death. The night before graduation, Sarah called her parents. Her mother was still worried, but there was pride in her voice now. Her father told her he had never been more proud of anyone in his life. Sarah had not only achieved her dream, but had opened doors for other women who would follow in her footsteps. Standing at graduation in her dress uniform, Sarah felt the weight of what she had accomplished. She was no longer just a girl from a small Texas town. She was a Navy SEAL, trained to handle the most dangerous missions in the world. As she received her SEAL trident, she thought about all the people who had doubted her, all the obstacles she had overcome. This was just the beginning of her story, and she was ready for whatever came next. 3 years after graduation, Sarah had proven herself on multiple deployments across the Middle East and Africa. She had conducted reconnaissance missions, participated in hostage rescues, and earned the respect of every team she worked with. Her reputation preceded her wherever she went. Other units specifically requested her for difficult operations, knowing she could handle pressure that would break most people, but nothing could have prepared her for the phone call she received on a quiet Tuesday morning at the base in Virginia. Her commanding officer's voice was grim as he explained the situation. A commercial airliner had been hijacked over international waters and forced to land on a remote island, controlled by a terrorist organization. Among the passengers were several high-ranking government officials and international diplomats. The terrorists were demanding the release of their imprisoned leader in exchange for the hostages. What made this mission different from any other rescue operation was the location. The island was heavily fortified, surrounded by treacherous waters, and the terrorists had proven to be well-organized and ruthless. Previous attempts by other military forces had failed catastrophically. The situation was desperate, and conventional approaches weren't working. Sarah's team was being deployed as part of a larger operation, but with a twist that made her stomach turn. Intelligence reports indicated that the terrorists had a particular hatred for female soldiers. They had captured 2 female Marines in a previous encounter and subjected them to horrific treatment before executing them publicly. The terrorist leader had made it clear that any woman who dared to set foot on their territory would face the same fate. The mission briefing was unlike anything Sarah had experienced before. The intelligence officer explained that the terrorists believed women in combat roles were an insult to their religious beliefs. They saw female soldiers as a weakness in Western military forces and took particular pleasure in demonstrating their supposed superiority by humiliating and killing women who challenged their worldview. Sarah's team leader, Commander Jackson, pulled her aside after the briefing. He was a seasoned veteran who had worked with her on 7 previous missions, and she could see the concern in his eyes. He explained that she didn't have to take this assignment. Given the specific threats against women, headquarters would understand if she chose to sit this one out. No one would question her courage or commitment, but Sarah knew that backing down now would validate everything the terrorists believed about women. It would prove their point that female soldiers were weak, that they would run when faced with real danger. She looked Commander Jackson in the eye and told him she wasn't going anywhere. If anything, the threats made her more determined to be part of the mission. The preparation phase was intense and focused. The team studied satellite images of the island, memorized the layout of the compound where the hostages were being held, and practiced the rescue scenario dozens of times. Sarah paid special attention to potential escape routes and defensive positions, knowing that if she was captured, the consequences would be far worse than for her male teammates. Her equipment was carefully selected for this mission. In addition to her standard weapons and gear, she carried specialized communication devices and emergency medical supplies. The team couldn't afford to have anyone become a liability, especially not in a situation where capture meant certain death. Sarah checked and rechecked every piece of equipment, knowing her life and the lives of her teammates depended on everything working perfectly. The night before deployment, Sarah video called her parents. She couldn't tell them where she was going or what she would be doing, but she wanted to hear their voices. Her mother sensed that something was different about this call, that the danger was greater than usual. Sarah reassured her that she was well-trained and surrounded by good people, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would be unlike anything she had faced before. Her teammates treated her no differently than they had on previous missions. They joked around, shared stories, and went through their usual pre-mission rituals. But Sarah could sense an underlying tension that hadn't been there before. Everyone knew the stakes were higher this time, that the enemy they were facing was more brutal and unpredictable than usual. As the transport helicopter lifted off toward their destination, Sarah looked out at the dark ocean below. Somewhere ahead of them was an island full of armed terrorists who would consider her capture a major victory. They had made it clear that they believed women had no place in warfare, that female soldiers were an abomination that deserved to be punished in the most brutal ways imaginable. Sarah adjusted her helmet and checked her weapon one final time. She had spent her entire military career proving that women could be just as capable and courageous as men. Now she was heading into a situation where that belief would be tested in the most dangerous way possible. The terrorists wanted to make an example of any woman who dared to challenge them. Sarah was about to show them what a real female warrior looked like. The helicopter touched down on a military vessel, positioned 12 nautical miles from the target island. Sarah and her 6-man team transferred to a smaller, faster boat that would take them closer to shore under cover of darkness. The intelligence briefing had been updated with disturbing new information. The terrorists had announced over social media that they were specifically hoping to capture female soldiers, promising to broadcast their executions live to the world. Sarah's team leader, Commander Jackson, gathered everyone for a final briefing on the boat's deck. The rescue plan was complex and dangerous. They would approach the island from the eastern shore, where rocky cliffs provided natural cover but made landing treacherous. From there, they would have to climb nearly 200 feet of sheer rock face while carrying full combat gear. One mistake would mean a fatal fall into the churning ocean below. The compound where the hostages were being held sat on a plateau at the center of the island, surrounded by dense jungle and multiple defensive positions. Intelligence indicated that approximately 40 terrorists were guarding the facility, armed with military-grade weapons and explosives. They had set up kill zones around the compound and stationed snipers in elevated positions throughout the area. What made the situation even more dangerous was the terrorists' psychological warfare tactics. They had been broadcasting audio recordings of the hostages pleading for help, mixed with threats about what would happen to any rescue force that dared to approach. The recordings specifically mentioned their desire to capture female soldiers and make examples of them for the world to see. As the boat approached the island, Sarah could make out the faint glow of lights from the compound in the distance. Somewhere in that heavily fortified position were innocent people, whose lives depended on this mission succeeding. Among the hostages were a family with 2 young children, several elderly diplomats, and the crew members from the hijacked aircraft. The terrorists had made it clear that any rescue attempt would result in the immediate execution of hostages. The boat's captain brought them as close to shore as he dared, but the final approach would have to be made by swimming. Sarah checked her waterproof equipment bags one more time, ensuring that her communications gear and weapons would survive the ocean crossing. The water was cold and rough, with waves that could easily smash an unprepared swimmer against the rocks. One by one, the team members slipped into the dark water and began swimming toward the cliff face. Sarah was third in line, following behind Rodriguez and Murphy while keeping visual contact with the swimmers ahead of her. The current was stronger than expected, threatening to push them off course toward a section of coastline that was heavily patrolled by enemy guards. The swim took nearly 30 minutes, and by the time Sarah reached the cliff base, her muscles were already tired from fighting the current. But this was just the beginning of the physical challenges they would face. The rock wall stretched up into the darkness above them, offering minimal handholds and footholds for the climb ahead. One slip would mean certain death on the jagged rocks below. Commander Jackson went first, testing each hold before signaling for the others to follow. Sarah watched as her teammates began the dangerous ascent, each one carrying over 60 pounds of equipment while navigating the treacherous cliff face. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below masked most noise, but they still had to climb in complete silence to avoid detection. When her turn came, Sarah began pulling herself up the rough stone surface. Her muscles burned from the swim, and the weight of her equipment made every movement a struggle. The rock was wet and slippery from ocean spray, forcing her to test each grip carefully before trusting it with her full weight. About halfway up, her foot slipped on a loose stone, sending small rocks tumbling down into the water below. The team froze, waiting to see if the noise had attracted attention. After several tense minutes with no response from the enemy, they continued their climb. Sarah's hands were raw and bleeding by the time she reached the top, but she ignored the pain. Physical discomfort was nothing compared to what the hostages were enduring, and she knew the real danger was still ahead of them. At the top of the cliff, the team regrouped and checked their equipment. Everything had survived the swim and climb, but they were already behind schedule. Dawn was still 3 hours away, giving them a narrow window to reach the compound, conduct the rescue, and extract the hostages before daylight made their mission impossible. The jungle between their position and the target was dense and filled with obstacles. Intelligence reports indicated that the terrorists had set up motion sensors and tripwires throughout the area. One wrong step could trigger an alarm that would alert every enemy fighter on the island to their presence. Sarah adjusted her night vision goggles and followed Commander Jackson into the dark undergrowth. Moving through the jungle was like navigating a maze in complete darkness. Every step had to be carefully placed to avoid snapping branches or stepping on anything that might make noise. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as they slowly made their way toward the compound, knowing that dozens of armed terrorists were somewhere ahead of them in the darkness. After an hour of careful movement, they reached a ridge overlooking the target facility. Sarah could see the compound clearly through her night vision scope. The terrorists had fortified the position well, with guard towers, razor wire, and patrol routes that covered every approach. Getting inside would require perfect timing and a lot of luck. But looking down at the building where innocent people were being held prisoner, Sarah knew they had to try. From their position on the ridge, Sarah and her team observed the compound for 2 hours, studying patrol patterns and identifying weak points in the defenses. The facility was larger than intelligence reports had indicated, with multiple buildings connected by covered walkways. The hostages were being held in the central structure, a concrete building with no windows and only 2 visible entrances. Both doors were heavily guarded. Commander Jackson made the difficult decision to split the team. 3 members would create a diversion at the main gate, drawing guards away from the hostage building. Meanwhile, Sarah and 2 others would infiltrate from the rear and attempt to reach the prisoners. It was a high-risk strategy that left both groups vulnerable, but conventional approaches had already failed twice. Sarah was paired with Corpsman Martinez and Sergeant Williams for the infiltration team. Williams was a demolitions expert who could breach the building's rear wall if necessary, while Martinez carried medical supplies for any injured hostages they might find. Sarah's role was to provide security and help coordinate the rescue once they were inside the compound. As they prepared to move out, Commander Jackson pulled Sarah aside one more time. The intelligence reports had been updated again during their observation period. The terrorists had specifically announced that they knew a female soldier was part of the rescue team. They had somehow obtained information about the mission and were prepared for her arrival. Jackson offered her one final chance to abort and wait with the extraction team. Sarah's response was immediate and firm. She had come too far to back down now, regardless of what the terrorists knew or planned. The hostages needed help, and she wasn't going to abandon them because some extremists wanted to make her a symbol of their twisted beliefs. If anything, their threats made her more determined to succeed and show the world that their ideology was built on lies and fear. The infiltration began at 0300 hours, with the diversion team moving toward the main gate, while Sarah's group approached from the opposite direction. The rear of the compound was less heavily defended, with only 2 roving patrols and a single guard tower covering the approach. Timing would be critical. They had to move between patrol schedules to avoid detection. Sarah and her teammates crawled through tall grass for nearly 20 minutes, moving only a few feet at a time to avoid triggering motion sensors. Her knees and elbows were scraped raw by the time they reached the outer perimeter fence, but she ignored the discomfort. Getting caught now would doom both the hostages and her teammates who were preparing to assault the main gate. The perimeter fence was topped with razor wire and electrified, but Williams had come prepared. He used a specialized tool to cut through the links while bypassing the electrical current, creating an opening just large enough for them to squeeze through. Sarah went first, her equipment snagging on the sharp edges as she pulled herself through the gap in the fence. Once inside the perimeter, they had to cross an open courtyard to reach the rear wall of the hostage building. This was the most dangerous part of the infiltration, as they would be completely exposed to the guard tower for nearly 30 seconds. Sarah checked her watch and confirmed that the tower guard was due to rotate in 2 minutes, giving them a narrow window when his attention might be distracted. The sound of gunfire erupted from the main gate, signaling that the diversion team had begun their attack. Sarah and her teammates used the noise and confusion to sprint across the courtyard, reaching the cover of the building just as additional guards rushed toward the sound of battle. Their insertion had gone undetected, but the real challenge was still ahead of them. Williams examined the rear wall and determined that it was too thick for a conventional breach. They would have to find another way inside, either through a door or window that intelligence had missed. Sarah spotted a ventilation grate near ground level that might be large enough for them to crawl through, but it would mean entering the building blind with no knowledge of what waited on the other side. Martinez volunteered to go first, as he was the smallest team member and most likely to fit through the narrow opening. Sarah watched as he removed the grate and disappeared into the darkness of the ventilation system. After several tense minutes, his voice crackled through their radio headsets, confirming that the passage led to a maintenance room inside the building. Sarah followed Martinez through the cramped ventilation shaft, her equipment making scraping sounds against the metal walls despite her efforts to move quietly. The passage was barely wide enough for her shoulders, and she had to push her rifle ahead of her as she crawled through the darkness. Williams came last, carrying the demolition charges they might need if the rescue went wrong. The maintenance room was small and cluttered with cleaning supplies and equipment. Martinez had already checked the door and confirmed that the hallway beyond was empty, but they could hear voices and movement from other parts of the building. Sarah studied the building layout on her tactical display, trying to determine the best route to where the hostages were being held. According to their intelligence, the prisoners were being kept in a large room on the ground floor, approximately 40 meters from their current position. To reach them, they would have to navigate several corridors and pass multiple doorways where guards might be stationed. The sound of gunfire from outside was growing more intense, indicating that the diversion was escalating as planned. Sarah took point as they moved into the hallway, her rifle raised and ready. The corridor was dimly lit by emergency lighting, creating deep shadows that could hide enemy fighters. Every few steps, she paused to listen for sounds that might indicate guards or other threats. The building seemed older than it had appeared from outside, with concrete walls that would contain sound and make communication with their team outside difficult. As they approached the first corner, Sarah heard voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. She held up her hand, signaling for her teammates to stop while she tried to determine how many people were ahead of them. The voices seemed to be coming from a room off the main corridor, possibly guards who were monitoring the situation outside or preparing to move additional weapons to defensive positions. Sarah made a quick decision. They could try to bypass the room and continue toward the hostages, but that would leave potential enemies behind them. Or they could neutralize the threat now, but that might alert other guards to their presence inside the building. Either choice carried significant risks, and there was no time for lengthy deliberation. Sarah signaled to her teammates and pointed toward the room where the voices were coming from. Martinez nodded and moved to cover the opposite side of the doorway, while Williams positioned himself to watch their rear. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to breach the room, knowing that once they engaged the enemy, stealth would no longer be an option. She counted down with her fingers. 3, 2, 1, then spun around the corner with her weapon raised. The room contained 4 terrorists hunched over a radio, trying to coordinate with their forces outside. Sarah's training took over as she engaged the targets with precise, controlled bursts. The entire firefight lasted less than 10 seconds, but the sound of gunfire inside the building would certainly alert other guards. Williams immediately began placing explosive charges on the walls while Martinez checked the radio, equipment the terrorists had been using. The radio chatter confirmed their worst fears. The enemy knew exactly where they were and was already moving forces to surround the hostage building. They had perhaps 3 minutes before overwhelming numbers of fighters would converge on their position. Sarah led them deeper into the building, moving faster now that stealth was no longer possible. The corridors seemed to stretch forever, and every shadow could hide an enemy fighter. The sound of boots running on concrete echoed from other parts of the building, indicating that the terrorists were mobilizing quickly to counter their infiltration. As they approached the area where intelligence indicated the hostages were being held, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold. From somewhere ahead came the sound of children crying and adults trying to comfort them in hushed tones. The hostages were close, but so were their captors. Sarah could hear guards shouting orders in the distance, their voices growing closer with each passing second. The final corridor before the hostage room was longer and more exposed than the others. Sarah could see a heavy wooden door at the far end, flanked by 2 armed guards who were clearly agitated by the sounds of fighting throughout the building. There was no way to approach without being seen, and any delay would bring more enemies to their position. Sarah made a tactical decision that went against all her training. Instead of waiting for backup or trying to find another route, she stepped boldly into the corridor and walked directly toward the guards. Martinez and Williams were stunned by her apparent recklessness, but they quickly realized her strategy. She was drawing the guards' attention and fire, giving them clear shots at the enemies while they were focused on her. The guards were so surprised to see a woman walking calmly toward them that they hesitated for a crucial second. Sarah used that moment of confusion to dive behind a concrete pillar, while her teammates engaged the targets from their concealed positions. The guards were eliminated before they could raise an alarm, but the gunfire would bring reinforcements within minutes. Williams ran to the door and began working on the locks while Sarah and Martinez established a defensive perimeter. The door was secured with multiple deadbolts and chains, indicating that the terrorists were taking no chances with their valuable prisoners. Williams worked frantically with his tools while the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder from multiple directions. When the door finally opened, Sarah was shocked by what she saw. The room contained over 30 hostages, including the diplomatic officials and airline crew they had expected, but also local civilians who had apparently been captured during previous terrorist operations. Among them were the two children she had heard crying, a boy and girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The hostages were in poor condition, showing signs of dehydration and mistreatment. Several appeared to have been beaten, and 2 were unconscious and would need to be carried during the evacuation. Sarah quickly surveyed the group while Martinez began providing medical attention to the most seriously injured prisoners. One of the diplomatic hostages, Ambassador Richardson, approached Sarah with relief evident in his voice. He explained that the terrorists had been preparing to execute several prisoners as an example to discourage rescue attempts. The executions had been scheduled for dawn, now less than 2 hours away. Sarah realized they had arrived just in time to prevent a massacre, but their problems were far from over. The sound of gunfire was now coming from multiple directions, indicating that the building was being surrounded. Sarah's radio crackled with urgent messages from Commander Jackson, reporting that the diversion team was under heavy attack and running low on ammunition. The extraction plan they had developed was falling apart under enemy pressure. Williams rigged explosive charges at strategic points throughout the building, while Sarah and Martinez prepared the hostages for movement. Many of the prisoners were weak and would need assistance, making their evacuation slow and vulnerable to enemy fire. The 2 unconscious hostages presented a particular challenge, as they would require 2 team members each to carry them to safety. Sarah made the difficult decision to split their group again. Martinez would lead the healthy hostages toward the extraction point through a route that avoided the heaviest fighting. Williams would carry one unconscious hostage while Sarah took the other, and they would follow a different path that was more direct but more dangerous. It was their only chance to get everyone out alive. As they prepared to leave the room, Sarah heard a sound that chilled her to the bone. From somewhere in the building came a woman's voice speaking in accented English over a loudspeaker system. The voice belonged to someone Sarah had heard about in intelligence briefings, Amira Hassan, the terrorist organization's chief interrogator and the person responsible for torturing captured female soldiers. Hassan's voice echoed through the corridors as she spoke directly to Sarah, somehow knowing she was listening. The terrorist announced that she knew a female American soldier was in the building and challenged her to surrender herself in exchange for the safe release of the hostages. Hassan promised that if Sarah gave herself up, the other prisoners would be allowed to leave unharmed. But if she continued to resist, all the hostages would be executed slowly and painfully. Sarah looked at the terrified faces of the people she had come to rescue. These innocent civilians had already suffered enough because of the terrorists' twisted ideology. The children were looking at her with hope in their eyes, trusting that she would somehow get them home safely. Ambassador Richardson was shaking his head, silently urging her not to consider Hassan's offer. But Sarah knew that Hassan's challenge was not just about the hostages. This had become a personal battle between 2 women with completely different beliefs about courage, strength, and what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. Hassan represented everything Sarah had spent her career fighting against, the belief that women were weak and could be broken through fear and violence. Sarah ignored Hassan's taunts over the loudspeaker and focused on getting the hostages moving. She had no intention of surrendering, but she also couldn't let innocent people die while she fought a personal battle with a terrorist. The evacuation had to proceed immediately. Before more enemy fighters surrounded the building and cut off all escape routes, Martinez led the first group of hostages toward the rear exit, taking the healthier prisoners who could move quickly and quietly. Sarah watched them disappear into the corridor, knowing she might never see Martinez again if things went wrong. Williams had rigged the building with enough explosives to level it, but they would need time to get clear before detonating the charges. Sarah hoisted the unconscious diplomat over her shoulder and began moving toward the alternate exit route she had identified earlier. Williams followed behind her, carrying the injured airline pilot while keeping watch for enemy forces. The man Sarah was carrying was heavier than she had expected, and his dead weight made moving through the narrow corridors extremely difficult. As they navigated the building's maze-like interior, Hassan's voice continued broadcasting threats and challenges. The terrorist leader seemed particularly focused on Sarah, describing in graphic detail what would happen to any woman who dared to oppose their organization. Sarah tried to block out the words, but Hassan's psychological warfare was clearly designed to get under her skin. The alternate exit led to a loading dock on the building's north side, where a covered truck bay provided some concealment from enemy snipers. Sarah and Williams reached the exit just as the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. Through a crack in the loading dock door, Sarah could see military trucks full of armed terrorists, racing toward their position from multiple directions. Their extraction plan had called for a helicopter pickup from a clearing 200 meters from the building, but reaching that point now seemed impossible. Sarah counted at least 40 enemy fighters deploying around the compound, and more vehicles were arriving every minute. The diversion team's attack had clearly failed to draw enough defenders away from the hostage building. Williams activated his radio and tried to contact Commander Jackson, but received only static in response. Either their communications equipment had been damaged, or Jackson's team had been captured or killed during their assault on the main gate. Sarah and Williams were on their own, carrying 2 unconscious hostages through territory that was rapidly filling with hostile forces. Sarah made a command decision that surprised Williams. Instead of trying to reach the extraction point, she decided they should head for the island's eastern shore, where steep cliffs would provide natural defensive positions. It was a longer route that would take them through dense jungle, but it might be their only chance to avoid the terrorist forces converging on the compound. They slipped out of the loading dock and into the darkness, moving as quickly as possible while carrying their heavy burdens. The unconscious diplomat Sarah was carrying began to stir, which was both good and bad news. Good because it meant he wasn't as seriously injured as they had feared. Bad because conscious hostages were harder to move quietly and might panic in a dangerous situation. The jungle was even denser than Sarah remembered from their insertion. Thick vines and low branches caught at their equipment and clothing, slowing their progress while enemy search teams spread out across the island. Sarah could hear dogs barking in the distance, indicating that the terrorists were using tracking animals to hunt for the escaped prisoners. About halfway to the cliffs, Williams stepped on something that made a metallic clicking sound. Sarah immediately recognized the noise. They had triggered a landmine. Williams froze completely, knowing that lifting his foot would detonate the device and kill them all. Sarah carefully examined the area around Williams's boot and confirmed her worst fears. The mine was an anti-personnel device designed to maim rather than kill. But the explosion would certainly alert every terrorist on the island to their location. Sarah had encountered similar devices during previous deployments and knew there might be a way to disarm it safely. She carefully brushed away dirt and leaves from around the pressure plate, revealing the mine's mechanism. It was an older Soviet design that she had studied during her training. But disarming it while in the field was extremely dangerous and required perfect precision. Working by feel in the darkness, Sarah located the arming mechanism and began the delicate process of rendering the mine safe. Williams remained perfectly still, supporting the weight of his unconscious hostage while trying not to shift his position on the pressure plate. The slightest movement could trigger the device and end their mission permanently. After several tense minutes, Sarah successfully disarmed the mine and signaled for Williams to step away carefully. They had avoided one disaster, but their troubles were far from over. The delay had allowed the terrorist search teams to get closer, and Sarah could now hear voices calling to each other through the jungle. The enemy was systematically sweeping the area and would reach their position soon. They pushed forward through increasingly difficult terrain, their unconscious charges becoming heavier with each step. Sarah's shoulders ached from carrying the diplomat, and her legs were beginning to shake from exhaustion. Williams was in similar condition, but neither of them could afford to rest while enemy forces were closing in around them. As they approached the cliffs, Sarah heard the sound she had been dreading, Hassan's voice calling to her through a bullhorn from somewhere behind them in the jungle. The terrorist leader had joined the search personally and was offering a final ultimatum. Sarah could surrender herself and guarantee the safety of the hostages she was carrying, or Hassan would order her forces to kill everyone they found without regard for civilian casualties. Sarah could see the cliff edge ahead of them, but she could also see the lights of flashlights and torches converging on their position from multiple directions. They were running out of time and options. The unconscious diplomat she was carrying was finally beginning to wake up and would soon be able to walk on his own. But the pilot Williams was carrying remained completely unconscious and would need medical attention soon. Standing at the edge of the cliff, Sarah realized they faced an impossible choice. They could try to climb down the treacherous rock face in darkness while carrying injured hostages, almost certainly resulting in someone falling to their death. Or they could make a stand at the cliff top and hope that rescue forces would arrive before they were overwhelmed by superior numbers. Sarah looked at Williams and saw the same determination in his eyes that had carried them this far. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to give up now. Behind them in the jungle, Hassan was still calling for Sarah's surrender, promising mercy for the hostages if she would just step forward and accept her fate. But Sarah had never backed down from a fight in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. Sarah positioned herself and Williams behind the largest rocks they could find near the cliff edge, creating defensive positions that would force the terrorists to approach across open ground. The unconscious pilot was finally beginning to stir, which meant both hostages would soon be able to take cover on their own. Sarah checked her ammunition and realized she had enough for perhaps 5 minutes of sustained combat. Williams set up his remaining explosive charges in strategic positions around their defensive perimeter. If they were going to be overrun, he could detonate the charges and take as many terrorists with them as possible. It wasn't the outcome they had hoped for, but it would prevent Hassan from capturing them alive and using their deaths for propaganda purposes. The sound of approaching footsteps grew closer, and Sarah could see the beams of flashlights dancing through the trees. Hassan's voice continued echoing across the jungle, but now her tone had changed. Instead of offering surrender terms, she was shouting orders to her fighters in their native language. Sarah didn't need a translation to understand that Hassan had lost patience and was preparing for a final assault. The first wave of attackers emerged from the tree line. Just as the eastern sky began to show the faintest hint of dawn, Sarah opened fire immediately, her shots carefully aimed to conserve ammunition while keeping the terrorists at a distance. Williams joined the defense, his rifle cracking steadily as he engaged targets trying to flank their position from the south. The battle was intense, but brief. The terrorists had superior numbers, but Sarah and Williams held the advantage of position and training. The enemy fighters were forced to advance across open ground while taking fire from concealed positions, making them easy targets for 2 experienced snipers. After 10 minutes of fighting, the surviving attackers retreated back into the jungle to regroup. During the lull in fighting, Sarah heard a sound that filled her with hope, the distant rumble of helicopter rotors approaching from the ocean. She activated her emergency beacon and began signaling with her tactical flashlight, hoping the rescue aircraft would spot their position before the terrorists mounted another attack. Williams continued watching the tree line while the 2 hostages took what cover they could find among the rocks. Hassan's voice rang out across the battlefield one final time, but now she sounded desperate rather than confident. The terrorist leader realized that rescue forces were approaching and that her opportunity to capture the female soldier was slipping away. She began screaming orders for her fighters to rush the defensive position regardless of casualties, promising rewards for anyone who could bring Sarah back alive. The second wave of attackers was larger and more determined than the first. Sarah could see at least 20 fighters emerging from multiple positions around the tree line, all converging on their location simultaneously. She and Williams would not be able to stop them all, but they could make the terrorists pay a heavy price for their victory. Sarah settled into her firing position and began engaging targets with methodical precision. Each shot was carefully aimed and accounted for, making every bullet count in what she knew might be her final battle. Beside her, Williams was doing the same, his demolitions training evident in the way he had positioned his remaining charges to maximize damage when the enemy overran their position. The sound of helicopter rotors was growing louder, and Sarah could now see military aircraft approaching from the east. But the terrorists were also advancing rapidly, and it would be a race to see whether rescue arrived before the defensive position was overwhelmed. Sarah continued firing, her rifle growing hot from sustained use as she tried to buy precious seconds for the rescue forces. Just as the lead terrorists reached the edge of their defensive perimeter, the rescue helicopters opened fire with their mounted machine guns. The devastating firepower swept across the attacking force, sending the survivors scrambling back toward the jungle for cover. Sarah had never been so happy to see American military aircraft in her entire career. The extraction was swift and professional. Within minutes, Sarah, Williams, and both hostages were aboard the lead helicopter and climbing away from the island. Below them, they could see Hassan and her remaining fighters retreating deeper into the jungle, their plans for a propaganda victory completely shattered. The compound was already burning from Williams's explosive charges, destroying whatever intelligence value it might have had. As the helicopter gained altitude, Sarah finally allowed herself to relax. The diplomat she had carried through the jungle was conscious and coherent, thanking her repeatedly for saving his life. The pilot was also recovering well, and would make a full recovery with proper medical treatment. Most importantly, Martinez's group had also been successfully extracted with all their hostages safe and unharmed. Commander Jackson's voice crackled through Sarah's headset as he reported in from the second helicopter. His diversion team had suffered casualties, but had accomplished their mission of drawing enemy forces away from the hostage building. All team members were alive and would be returning home, though several would require extended medical treatment for their injuries. Sarah looked back at the island one final time as it disappeared behind them. Somewhere down there, Hassan was probably already planning her next operation. Her hatred for female soldiers undoubtedly intensified by this defeat. But Sarah had proven something important on that island, that courage and determination were not limited by gender, and that women could be just as capable and fearless as any warrior. The rescue mission had succeeded beyond all expectations. Over 40 hostages had been freed, including the high-ranking officials whose capture had sparked the international crisis. The terrorist organization's stronghold had been destroyed, and their plans for executing prisoners on live television had been completely thwarted. Most importantly for Sarah, she had faced down the enemy's attempts to use her gender against her, and emerged victorious. As the helicopters flew toward the safety of the naval fleet waiting offshore, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a small town in Texas to the elite ranks of the Navy SEALs, she had constantly faced people who doubted her abilities because she was a woman. This mission had been the ultimate test of everything she had trained for and believed in. The terrorists had expected to break her spirit and use her capture as proof that women were weak and unsuited for combat. Instead, Sarah had shown them exactly what a determined woman could accomplish when she refused to accept limitations imposed by others. She had not only survived their psychological warfare, but had turned their own tactics against them, using their underestimation of her as a tactical advantage. When the helicopters finally reached the fleet, Sarah was greeted as a hero by the naval personnel who had been monitoring the mission. News of the successful rescue had already reached military command, and word was spreading quickly through the media about the female Navy SEAL who had helped save dozens of innocent lives. Sarah knew that her actions on the island would inspire other women to pursue military careers and prove that gender was no barrier to courage and excellence.